This episode is in English, but it's a podcast in French, so please bear with me a minute as I need to introduce in French. Donc, comme vous voyez, cet épisode est en anglais. Pourquoi ? Parce que je pense que on passe à côté d'énormément de choses si on se cantonne à l'information disponible en une seule langue et si on reste centré sur le seul point de vue franco-français. Nous avons une manière de voir le monde qui est forcément différente de celle d'un Chinois, d'un Brésilien ou même d'un Anglais. Et c'est, je pense, très important de s'ouvrir à d'autres points de vue, surtout si on veut parler d'enjeux globaux. Donc l'anglais est bien pratique parce que c'est de fait devenu la langue universelle et qui permet de parler à peu près à tout le monde. Donc voilà, je compte donc aussi poster d'autres épisodes en anglais à des gens qui ne parlent pas forcément français ou qui ne sont pas francophones. Donc si vous ne parlez pas anglais, je vous propose d'aller sur YouTube et de faire fonctionner le traducteur automatique, ça devrait marcher à peu près bien. Et sinon, vous pouvez tout simplement lire le résumé. Dans cet épisode, je parle d'innovation avec David Rowan, ancien rédacteur en chef de la version britannique du magazine Wired, qui est une des revues de sciences et de technologie les plus lues au monde. Donc à une époque où tout bouge très vite, innover, c'est savoir s'adapter, et donc ça m'intéresse. Bon épisode.
The most important thing that we still have in Western Europe is freedom of expression. I suspect the established institutions are going to be relatively ineffective in solving climate change.
So, thanks a lot for accepting to spend a half an hour with me. It will be a shorter format than usual, but I think we've got a few topics to cover when it comes to understand, how innovation works. I know you've just finished a new book and you've been spending a lot of time on working on this project. Can you tell me a bit more about what you've been doing lately and what is your topic of the moment and why this is important?
I was running the UK edition of Wired for 8 years. I set it up and it was tracking the people building the future, the crazy ones, the people in the startup clusters, in the university research labs, trying to raise money to build something that didn't exist because they thought the world needed it. And I was excited. And then I would often be asked to go and talk at a corporate event or brief a leadership team. And they wanted some of this startup magic, and yet they didn't want to change today's business because shareholders wanted more of the same. And so they created this theatre of innovation. They had a lab with a startup in it. They had their corporate accelerator. They had job titles like Chief Digital Disruption Officer and Innovation Sherpa. And none of this amounted to anything. It was all just a bit pointless. And it was dishonest because it was denying the realities that were transforming these businesses. And every sector, from banking to transport to manufacturing, are going through the same real transformations. You can't stop digital changing the rules. I became a bit obsessed with the wasted talent and money going into these fake innovation projects. And I thought there must be some established, incumbent, old-style businesses that were becoming very different businesses. What if I could find them and understand how they were doing this and explain the strategies? And so I ended up getting on a lot of economy seats of aeroplanes. And I'm a journalist. I ask lots of people, have you heard of anything? And eventually I get some really good suggestions, which took me to Peru and China and Estonia. And I think my main skill in life is to be able to sleep in the economy seat of an aeroplane. But you'll realize after a while that there are extraordinary leaders who think in such bold, fresh ways and execute and create these little bubbles of cultures where they're achieving phenomenal things and they are able to reinvent. So that was what my book was about.
So you were looking for the real thing, like not just the talkings, like what is actually being made, right?
I am a skeptic as a journalist, and I have pretty well-trained bullshit detectors, because everybody's selling something. And, I've edited the comment page of The Guardian. I have written investigative pieces about cults, and you become very adept at working out who is for real. And I'm now investing in startups as well. And it's a similar skill set you need, because you don't have much data at an early part of a company's journey. So you have to assess whether this team of founders is for real. Do they have the ability to attract and motivate talent, to execute on their vision, to be strong and resilient when things go wrong? So I wanted to find the very few people who were effective.
Okay, so let's try to go to the root of that, bullshit thing around innovation, because indeed we can see that innovation has become really a buzzword. I don't know really when it started, but it's really there. So every business feels that huge, at urge to innovate. Every country also start also to think this way. We need to do better. We need to do things differently. Why so? And what innovation means, and why would there be kind of an obligation and an urgency to innovate in the first place?
Clayton Christensen famously wrote about the Innovators Dilemma. You've got an established business model. It's been making very nice revenues in a certain way, and yet the outside world changes. You're in denial initially about the potential scale of the change. You don't want to kill today's profit centers, even when you realize this change is going to be quite significant. And you culturally can't move as quickly as people with less to lose and a greater willingness to take risks. Now, the problem for all kind of organizations at the moment is this digital thing is no longer a concept. So Wired is published by Condé Nast, which is a beautiful magazine publisher that's published Vogue and Vanity Fair. And let's say for many years, Condé Nast hoped the internet was going to go away because it was just an annoyance, and everybody would always want to look at their shiny fashion photography. Eventually, when people's behavior changes en masse, and you realize that maybe Instagram has a greater reach than the shiny magazines, you're forced to acknowledge this reality.
So it's a changing context, basically. There is a changing context because of external innovations, because there is a new technology, new behaviors that are arriving, and therefore every company and also every person even is kind of forced to change and to adapt and to innovate to stay ahead of the game. That's kind of the race that's happening.
What's digital transformation doing? It's turning stuff that was expensive into stuff that's free. It's getting rid of the barriers to entry to starting a competitor to your business. It's allowing anybody to access a customer directly through crowdfunding websites and decentralized networks. It's allowing anybody to get access to cash to start something through crowdfunding. It's allowing anybody to access the powerful computer networks through hiring a bit of cloud service time. It turns anybody into a global marketing machine if they manage to get the right dynamic on social media. So the old world where you were safe, and even if you're a regulated industry, you can no longer protect yourself by being regulated. You're now facing people moving very quickly, offering amazing value to customers, and with no guarantee that you'll still be relevant in a couple of months. So how do you create a culture inside an organization that can keep reinventing where it's offering value to the market.
So it's it's the rules of the game are kind of changing. So you need to adapt, and you see that most of the big companies, are spending a lot of energy and resources to kind of stay ahead, even once they get it, then when they get that the world is changing. But it seems that they can't really stay ahead, right? You still have smaller players disrupting them, and they need to buy them in the end. And sometimes, like that's another question I have. Like, but how is that? How bigger institutions, bigger organizations don't really manage to move fast enough to change and lead the game?
There's a couple of exceptions, and that usually is when there's a leader who can avoid shareholder pressure, can avoid short-term thinking, often because they're the founder of the organization, or because the organization is owned by the staff or the customers. But in general, the incentive systems are all wrong. If you are leading, let's say, a manufacturing business that's making fridges and ovens, you have invested a lot of money in your infrastructure, in your factory supply chain, in your sourcing, in your robots making these things. And you're going to really hope that these new connected devices become marginal and irrelevant. And initially, you're probably going to deny and laugh at them. At some stage, when the customer increasingly wants it, you're going to be probably too slow to provide, because you're going to have internal bureaucracy, you're going to have internal resistance and politics, and a mindset that thinks, well, we've been the kings for so long, why would anybody look at an emerging company that's got no track record? Unfortunately, Nokia and Microsoft both had a similar response to this thing called the iPhone in 2007. Unfortunately, Time Warner had the same response to this emerging company called Netflix. And the head of Time Warner famously told the New York Times, "Is the Albanian army going to take over the world? I don't think so." And it's overconfidence because of historic achievement, plus legacy thinking that stops you being agile and nimble in moving fast.
In this podcast, I like to talk about also like bigger issues, that we're going to face, including the climate crisis of these things. Could we apply that bias, that we may all have to this type of crisis, like the inability to think long term and the overconfidence that we have in innovating and in solving problem constantly? And could that explain why we are also like in trouble and can't really react?
I suspect the established institutions are going to be relatively ineffective in solving climate change because they have become comfortable in their role as talking shops. They have been habituated to the limitations of transformation. And the people who are going to change behavior are going to be the pirates, the people coming from the edges, the Greta as a schoolgirl, the people stopping the traffic in the middle of your city, decentralized movements with no power base, with no resources, but a very, very strong mission. And what is a startup but a small purpose-led organization with no resources, but a determination to try and iterate? The great thing about access, democratization of these new technologies is there are people coming out of universities with skills relating to geoengineering with new ways to create alternatives to plastic, with advanced thinking on emerging fuels, that if we can create an entrepreneurial culture for these people with great research knowledge, then we can let the market try and make a big impact. So I would not trust a government department or an international organization to solve plastic in the ocean, because there are too many vested interests that will lobby them. I would trust a small entrepreneurial organization that finds a way to make an economically viable and yet scalable alternative to plastic, to find a fast-growing consumer base and then be acquired by one of the bigger companies.
So, and I know there is a lot of debate, between what's the best solution, to tackle these type of systemic issues. Some people say yes, the government has still a role to play, and we should go back into planning, because private interests, will always be focusing on short term. You say this is not the case, because there are inherently things related to how government works that would prevent them from doing it the right way. That's correct.
There are vested interests that find a way to corrupt established organizations. The amount of lobbying money that's, even the tech companies now have realized, if you're Google and Facebook, you need to scale up your budgets and your staff in Washington, in Brussels, to try and influence the policymakers. And monopoly capitalism is a history of supposedly idealistic organizations that are telling a story about empowering the world and making all the world's information freely available to everybody, becoming I think I'd use the word corrupted and manipulative, and trying to distort consumer regulation and become political, trying to shape power.
But that's the thing. Like, these are private interests, right? Preventing the like a national organization to function well, kind of, right? Because through influence and lobbies. So then, how do you trust the private sector in solving these issues, especially when you know that the big guys, the big tech companies, for example, are buying out their innovation, and there is a lot of change that even if you come up with an innovative model, even in plastic or these things, you end up being bought by a big organization that has really no interest, in changing the overall thing. Where the solution could be coming from, and how do you see innovation playing a role to challenge that, and so that we can think longer term, for example.
The most important thing that we still have in Western Europe is freedom of expression, the ability to suggest things that challenge those in powers, the ability to connect groups of people with a shared interest in fomenting change. The most useful innovation in the short term, I think, will be ways to sustain, ways to keep that conversation both prominent and solvent. So I worry that serious news media have been struggling economically, and clickbait and maybe Russian-sponsored news media are finding an audience. How do we innovate in the information flow? How do we find a way for a really informed but important debate about air quality in our cities, and the barriers to carbon neutral fuel being used?
So innovation comes from places you don't expect, and usually, as you said, from the edges. What are the techniques, or what are the things that we could be working on? I know there is not a secret recipe, but what are the things that we could be taking away and say, okay, I will use that to make sure that this is happening again and again and again. Beyond, I understand that the information needs to continue to be flowing, but as a citizen, what can you be doing to help that innovation emerge in the right direction?
So first of all, let's stop talking about innovation as some mystical religion. It's very simple. Innovation is building future-facing value in our organizations. So if I'm making a pain au chocolat and the market demand is more and more people are suffering from gluten intolerance, can I create a product line that meets this demand before other people have, in a way that the customer wants? If I'm making motor cars and, climate becomes more of an issue and air quality becomes more of an issue, can I create Tesla and make it sustainable even when everybody's laughing at me? So 10 years, the big car companies think, can we buy this guy?
So it really comes from people demand in the first place, right?
It comes from being prepared to do unpopular and often stupid things to test emerging behavior and emerging demand. And this is why startup culture is so brilliant. 9 out of 10 startups will probably fail, but the one that succeeds will find a new way to let you stay on vacation in somebody's apartment. Will find a new way for you to borrow somebody else's spare seat in their car going between cities. The big organizations could not do this because to them it seems stupid. There is no rule book for innovation. For my book, Non-Bullshit Innovation, I found 16 strategies that seem to be working for certain organizations. And often it was about culture and mindset. Often it was something simple like the hierarchy is no longer relevant. It's not about what the boss wants to do. It's about finding a way to empower everybody in a team so that your most junior employees are listened to. Or it's about finding ways to bring people together, diverse types of thinkers, so that they're comfortable proposing something new. At Google X, they talk about having psychological safety, so that in a meeting, if I say something that's kind of weird, you don't laugh. It's tested. Maybe I get a little bit of budget to start experimenting with it, but it's open-minded. Because if you think about some of the great transformations of the last century, they were really weird at the very, very beginning. The idea that...
they came from pirates and, people in the ages, right?
But they also challenged behavior in a very, very odd way. If you think about your behavior on your phone, it's not just the amount of data you're giving the network without having a clue that the network is now selling this data. It's you've created this virtual persona of yourself through your Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and other accounts, which probably isn't making you very happy, but you've somehow been led to cultivate a super high achieving, happy version of yourself that's not quite honest, but you are spending quite a lot of hours of the day getting that perfect image. Go back 10 years. Ask yourself, would you do this? Of course you wouldn't. But there's something called social proof, and there's something called peer pressure, and there's something called, the hunt for dopamine. And we've been trained by those lab rats to use these techs.
But that's the thing also, because this was not a natural behavior, 10 years ago, and this is why it was very difficult to imagine. And yet, these organizations, starting with Facebook, have created that behavior to get our attention. This is why we talk about the attention economy. So in a world today where we are more and more kind of being manipulated, having access to limited information or living in bubbles, how this new reality is changing also where innovation is coming from. Because, you would expect, as you were saying, innovation to come from people's new demands or new habits. But since that demand and that way of looking at the world is now being biased by these organizations, what is to be done, so that there is innovation happening in the right way and not necessarily to the profit of the existing organization in place that have become so powerful? Do the startup have still a role to play, or are they inherently part of the game and depend on the bigger ones? Have we been too far?
The problem with monopoly capitalism that's not very regulated, as we find ourselves now, is there are going to be startups that create alternative ways, kinder ways for people to express themselves. And yet the power, not just economic power, but access to talent of the big tech monopolies is going to kill them, is going to squeeze them. I went to see the team at WhatsApp when they were not owned by Facebook. I did a story about them about 5 years ago. And they said it was, in their words, against their ethics to sell to a big tech company. It's against their integrity. And then a couple of months later, $19 billion on the table, they sell to the big tech company. And, when the founders of WhatsApp left Facebook a few months ago, they said some very hostile things about Facebook. And, it sounded like they were frustrated by their experience. But they were the ones who sold out to the big monopoly capitalists. And this is how the thing seems to work. So the only way in the past we've been able to keep space for fresh organizations to grow, the innovators, is by very strong central regulation. Andrew Carnegie was broken up by the American antitrust laws. Margaret Vestager has done a bit in Europe. I think we need a lot more institutional action to limit the market dominance of a lot of these big companies. Because when there are network effects and you have access to all the data, it's impossible for somebody to emerge and compete with you.
So the game is kind of rigged now. And the innovation flow isn't normal when it should be optimum.
It's not just rigged; it's more pernicious than it has been with previous monopoly capitalism situations like this.
Why is that?
Because these companies are tracking your emotion, your desires, your transactions, your behavior. Facebook is issuing a digital currency. One of the things it is able to do now is use its knowledge of your economic interaction to get even deeper inside your soul and cross-target you and manipulate you. And I just wonder if it's something we collectively want. A very, very small number of shareholder-owned organizations still controlled by people who are socially dysfunctional in some cases, and have made ethically very, very dubious decisions in the past. If we want those companies shaping not just what we want to buy, but what we believe, what we care about, I just think it's a scary moment.
What are and to finish on that, what are the takeaways, for individuals? What can be applied to, has someone you should learn to behave, or any skill set that you need to develop to live in this fast changing world?
Get out of your bubble. Read about things that you don't think are relevant to you. Learn about some of the emerging specialisms. If I'm an entrepreneur in manufacturing, I should go to a blockchain conference to understand how those people are thinking. I should go to a human rights conference to understand how people facing all sorts of constraints are using decentralized networks and security. Because we still haven't solved a lot of the emerging problems. Cybersecurity. The next big conflicts are going to involve critical infrastructure being compromised so that, the ATMs don't work and the hospitals don't work. We need to understand how these vulnerabilities affect every organization. We need to know why secure communication actually is something that we should all care about. So I think education doesn't stop now at 21 after university. It has to renew itself and continue all the time. And we're lucky. As I said, in Western Europe, we can still read widely and say things. I go to China a lot. It's even now increasingly happening in places like Hungary, where any inconvenient ideas are suppressed. And then, in a worrying way, you are slaves to the dominant ideology.
So it's paying attention to your information sources to start with.
Stay hungry and stay foolish and ask lots of questions. And again, don't stop reading. Pictures are great. Swipe as many pictures as you want, but make sure you have time to have a sustained idea expressed by somebody who can articulate words.
Thanks a lot, David. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Merci.
Merci beaucoup d'avoir pris le temps d'écouter cet épisode. N'hésitez pas à découvrir les autres épisodes déjà publiés dans lesquels j'explore d'autres points de vue, d'autres clés de lecture sur les forces à l'œuvre qui feront le monde de demain. Vous pouvez vous abonner à ce podcast sur votre appli préférée pour être sûr de ne rien rater, et je vous invite aussi à laisser un commentaire ou un avis, 5 étoiles si possible, sur Apple Podcasts ou iTunes pour m'aider à rendre ce podcast visible. Vous pouvez retrouver cet épisode sur sismic.fr avec toutes les références citées, ainsi que d'autres liens pour continuer à creuser les sujets évoqués. C'est Sismic, c'est demain et ça bouge. À bientôt.